Hi, in this video let me throw light on the finer aspects of writing an introduction for a research paper. An appealing introduction actually sets the context for your research paper. In the first part of the video, let me discuss about some of the important components for writing a good introduction. In the second part, let me discuss with you a sample paper from a highly cited journal, and let us discuss the important components of introduction in that paper. Eventually, let me practically apply all the principles that I discuss using a worksheet. I would also leave a copy of the worksheet in the description box for you to download. So whenever you prepare your introduction, you can use that as a guideline and prepare your introduction. So to answer the first question, what are the components of a good introduction? Well, a good introduction in a research paper should address the following criteria. A. Initially, you need to set the context for the study. So the first point is you need to write a good background to the study. A background should start from something generic and move on to specific. For instance, if your research paper is on achieving learning outcomes in an online classroom in higher education, your background in the initial part you may deal with online education in general in respect to higher education, and then you move on to something very specific and you will address this issue of learning outcomes. You know what kind of studies have dealt with learning outcomes. So you will just talk about the current scenario, that's general topic, and then move on to something specific. So having set the context, having written the background for your study, a generic background and the specific background, you will move on to writing a need for your research paper. What is the need to write on that particular area? So one or two sentences to emphasize the real need for that kind of research. And from there you move on to objectives. The objectives can be classified into two types: the primary objective and the secondary objective. Of course, if you have a secondary objective for your research paper, you can mention your secondary objective. So objective, what is the aim of your study? What does the paper aim to do? For instance, you can say the objective of the study is to assess the learning outcomes of online classroom in higher education, because that's your topic. So what is the objective of your study? You will clearly state the objective. And after clearly stating the objective in your introduction, you will move on to review in detail. So your review should be absolutely focused and it should be in alignment with the primary objective of your study. So previous studies that have dealt with online education in the higher education landscape, you will discuss, and you will also discuss about outcomes as we discussed earlier. This is just a sample. Any paper you write, it should be very focused to the topic and to the objective. So when you write a review, you will see what kind of consensus people have, what kind of agreements people have on that issue, what kind of agreements researchers have on that particular issue. And you will also read the disagreements that people have. Are there any conflicting opinions that people have about the topic? So you will document the conflicting opinions. And ultimately you will move on to what are the solutions proposed by other researchers, and what are the solutions you are proposing, and how are your solutions different from the solutions of other researchers. So you will talk about all this in your review of literature. So probably I'll do a different video exclusively on writing a review of literature for a journal paper, but generally in the introduction you will touch upon the review and you will discuss these aspects. So ultimately you will talk about your action plan. You will talk about how your paper, the remaining part of your paper, you are going to document the remaining part of your paper. So remember that your research paper should address these issues. As I said, A, it should talk about the background, and then you will move on to the need for the study, and then the primary objective and the secondary objective. You will do a review of literature in context to the primary objective, and in the review of literature you will address the consensus, you will address the agreements of previous researchers, disagreements and conflicting opinions, and you will also talk about the solutions proposed by others and your solution. So, I will be talking about all this. Now, based on what I discussed, I will show you a sample paper from a highly indexed journal. Let us analyze various components and let's see if the paper has all the components that I was discussing now. Finally, I will give you an action plan matrix. As I said before, let us analyze the sample paper in the context of what we have discussed earlier. So look, this is a sample paper from a journal called Internet and Education, one of the top journals in educational technology. The topic of this paper is blending a class video blog to optimize student learning outcomes in higher education. Let us analyze the various components of an introduction and how the authors have fulfilled the parameter in every segment. As I discussed before, in the first part of your introduction, you need to state the background, and the background should be quite captivating and it should attract the international readers or the target audience to your paper. See, look at this particular introduction. See, the topic, as I said, is blending a class video blog to optimize student learning outcomes in higher education. See, look, the first sentence is very generic. The author states that the ultimate goal of educational change in school education is to enhance student learning outcomes. So they give a very generic background and they move on to specific. Look how they move on to specific. A bank of empirical studies have been conducted to document the impact of blogging on student learning experience, mainly in terms of performance or affective outcomes. So they are focusing on their variable now. So this is how a background moves from generic to specific. So that is the first part of your introduction, that is setting the context. Now let us analyze the second part of this paragraph, second part of the paragraph. Look at the second part of the paragraph. The second paragraph, as I said earlier, should focus on the need for the study and the objectives. Look carefully at how the sentences are constructed. Some research and performance outcomes generally covered the issues to foster reflection, critical thinking, and knowledge construction. These studies have not addressed video blogging in higher education. So they very clearly state that these kind of studies have been carried out, but with respect to my variable, previous studies have not addressed this issue. So the author has very clearly emphasized the need for the study. And now he'll be moving on to objectives. Look at the transition in the next sentence. Hence, this study aims to address video blogging in higher education. So they have moved on to objectives specifically. As I said before, your objectives can be classified into primary objectives and secondary objectives. So having stated the background and the need and the objectives, the authors now move on to show in detail what other researchers have done with respect to their objectives, with respect to the research variables that they are going to discuss. Please read these sentences. Most of the previous studies employed textual blogging in different subject courses. Previous researchers mostly documented the same classes of students' self-perceived experience rather than the outcomes. So the authors very clearly state that the previous research on learning outcomes with respect to video blogging has not been carried out before. But what has been done earlier, they clearly state that. So earlier studies have employed textual blogging they have compared self-perceived experience, they have compared the achievement outcomes. So what has been done earlier, the authors have clearly stated, and they have also mentioned the counterclaims. So of online instruction. As I said before, you can present your counterclaims, the consensus that others have on this issue, and the kind of disagreements you can say in detail. So after making all the counterclaims and after establishing your niche, you need to move on to what you are going to do to fill that research gap. So the authors have showed how or what kind of gap is there in research. And now they will explain how they are going to fill the gap. To fill the gap, this study explored the effects of blending a class video blog into optimizing undergraduate students' learning experience in an oral training course. So, what is the gap and how they are going to fill the gap? So, the authors have clearly stated here. They have stated about, they have very clear about their claim and the significance of their claim. So, what are they going to do to fill the research gap? They have stated. So, having reviewed the previous studies and after identifying the research gap, now is the time to present your research questions. See how the authors here have presented their research questions. Just analyze these passages. So, the following research questions are addressed, and the research questions should be in sync with your primary objectives. See, do undergraduate students engaging in class-based video blogging outperform others? Or do these students with video blogging experience have more willingness to communicate in the target language compared with their counterparts? So, after identifying the gap, they have very clearly stated their research questions, what they intend to test. So, this is how you need to write an introduction chapter. Eventually, the authors will mention about their desired plan, their proposed plan on how they are going to carry the research study. So, see, the current study investigates both self-reported data and oral proficiency tests when comparing an experimental group with a control group receiving face-to-face instruction. So, how are they going to report the studies? They give an overview in their introduction and then they'll move on to methods. So, this is how you need to write an introduction. To once again briefly recap, state your background, which is general, move on to something specific, and then state the need of your study, explain your primary and secondary objectives, and then do a review of previous studies, show what the other researchers have done, say if there are any counterclaims or a consensus on the topic, and the proposed solutions, your solution, and then after identifying a niche, focus on the research gap and also say how you are going to fill the gap. And after doing that, move on to your research questions. Very clearly state that these are your research questions. And ultimately, wind up your introduction chapter with a proposed plan on how you are going to proceed in the remaining part of your paper. So this is a sample intro. So let's move on to this action plan matrix. So let me show you this action plan worksheet and how you can, for your research context, do the introduction chapter. See, if you look at the introduction chapter as one single entity, it will be really overwhelming for you to write. But if you break it into various segments, just as this worksheet, and if you put whatever you need to fill in every segment, then you can quite easily write an introduction. Ultimately, you can bring all these components and present it as an introduction. So perhaps 2 days you may spend for background information and maybe 1 day for the need for the study. So depending on your convenience, you can chunk the information and you can fill in the worksheet. Then collectively you can take it and put it in your introduction. I think this is one easy way to write a research paper, by chunking the information into fragments. Now look at this action plan matrix. I have just presented a paper called Blended Models for Open Learning in Higher Education. It's an empirical study. As I said in the background information, I need to write a generic background and specific background. So I have written a generic and specific background as a sample. Based on this sample, you may present your generic and specific background. And then in this paper, I have just moved on to mention the need for the study, its importance. Why is this study important? So I have just given you a sample structure. So you can replace it with your structure based on your context. And thirdly, I have presented the objectives, the primary objective of the study and the secondary objective of the study. So after having stated the objectives, I will in detail discuss about the previous studies that address this specific phenomena. Now related to my research, I have addressed some studies, focused studies that focuses only on my research variable. So I have presented such studies. See, I have a separate column. Then I have a separate column for solutions proposed by other researchers. What are the consensus? What are the agreements related to my area? So I have mentioned all those agreements presented by other researchers. And in a separate column, I have mentioned the conflicting opinions. Are there any conflicting opinions presented by other researchers in the domain? So what are those conflicting opinions? Now after doing all that, now I have mentioned my gap, my research gap that needs to be filled. And after mentioning the gaps, I have moved on to the research questions here. So based on all this, now I will arrive at my research questions and hypothesis. So these are my research questions. So whatever I have given you is a sample structure. You can replace it with your structure. Ultimately, I have discussed the action plan, like what is the proposed plan for me to write. So for example, I have said in this current investigation collected empirical data using a control and an experimental group. Now then I will move on to discuss about my methods. And this is how you write a complete introduction chapter. Now look at this downloadable worksheet, apply it in your context. So I have mentioned all the segments. Background information as one column, need another column, objectives another column, and previous studies that have addressed the specific phenomena, one separate column for consensus, for conflicting opinions, and then for gaps, and then mention your research questions and your proposed solution. So probably you can take 2 days each for filling in the sheet. Maybe in 10 days you can write a tentative introduction, and finally maybe you can revisit and revise that. So I hope you found this video on preparing an effective introduction for writing a research paper to be quite helpful. Thank you for viewing.